Well, Ukraine's allies say they are willing to pay for defence manufacturing by Ukrainian companies in their own countries. The announcement came at a meeting of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group at NATO headquarters in Brussels on Wednesday. All NATO countries are expected to significantly boost their military spending after the US demanded they sign up to new ambitious targets at their annual summit in 3 weeks.
For freedom and for peace.
Will NATO's Hague summit be the date where the US and Europe go Dutch on defence? Will they all pay their own shares with dramatically boosted budgets? That's the plan.
And this is why I assume that in The Hague we will agree on a hard defence spend target of, in total, 5%.
5%, as demanded by Donald Trump, although Secretary General Rutte insists the figure comes instead from what allies need to spend on their own capabilities to fulfill NATO's overall defense plan to deter Russia. Here's the formula he's floated. Governments would allocate 3.5% of their budgets to traditional defense needs. The other 1.5% would come from expenditures such as cybersecurity, infrastructure upgrades to improve military mobility, assistance to Ukraine, and other categories still under discussion. Over on NATO's border with Russia, Baltic budgets are leading the way. These stone walls that have encircled Tallinn from the 13th century are no longer of any use in protecting the country against aggressive neighbors. That's why this Baltic nation is among a very small handful of NATO allies that are already pledging to spend at least 5% of their GDP on their own defense. 5.4% to be precise.
It was not easy. And for that, you need to have the political decisions to explain why we need to increase the taxes, why we need to cut in some sectors, why do we need to take additional debt.
Estonian citizens accept the sacrifices.
As a mom, I'm anxious. And that's why, yes, there's no money, but I'm willing to give that extra money for defense, actually.
I feel that war can be just happen, something like that.
But further from the front line, some countries aren't even spending 2% yet, the previous target set 11 years ago. Security analyst Giuseppe Spadafora says it's time for these governments to boost budgets and be brutally honest.
You are connected to the others. You're not doing it out of goodwill, just like you're not defending Ukraine out of your goodwill. You're doing it because it's an investment on your own security. That's the message that needs to be shared with the publics.
The Belgian government has bitten that bullet and is dealing with the consequences of adding billions to military spending while cutting elsewhere. Defense Minister Theo Franken knows far more will have to be pledged, but says the proposed spending split will help.
I think we don't have to panic. I think that we will have parts. We will have 7 years, 10 years, maybe even more. But we're doing a lot of security spending. We're doing a lot of infrastructure investments that is not counted under the 2% for the moment.
NATO negotiations are now focused on finalizing this funding deal. European diplomats say they're willing to portray it as a Donald Trump win to ensure the Hague summit goes off without a hitch.
Now, as you heard, Donald Trump has been pushing the Europeans to up their NATO spending to 5% of GDP on defence since his first administration. I asked Rachel Rizzo earlier from the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., if we're going to get there.
Well, the thing about the measuring percentage of defense spending as a percentage of GDP, it's a little bit of a problem just because I don't think it adequately measures the value of an ally. Certainly, European countries have been increasing their defense spending steadily over the last decade. And so I think this should please Donald Trump. The measurement up until now has been that they should spend 2% of their GDP on defense. I think 5% is going to be a reach for a lot of these countries, but I think they all realize that the geopolitical situation is changing. The U.S. is reorienting itself away from Europe, and they really need to take responsibility for their own security. So I think the numbers will be on the table at this summit. Whether or not European countries can actually get there and how long that will take, I think, is another question.
I'll pick you up on that reorientation word. There are growing concerns among European NATO allies that the US might withdraw its troops from Europe to focus on the Indo-Pacific. Is this a real-world possibility as you see it?
So I think there's a couple of things here. I do think that it is a very real possibility that the United States will withdraw some troops from Europe over the next few years. I don't know what that might look like. I don't think anyone knows what that will look like as of now. There haven't been any official announcements, but the Trump administration, including Trump himself and high-level members of his administration, have all said that there could be some sort of troop decrease over the next few years. What I don't think is that those troops will be removed from Europe and sent to the Indo-Pacific region. Remember, Trump ran on a campaign of less war, more peace, fewer wars, and we can argue about whether or not and how that is the case. So I think that if he withdraws troops from Europe, it will be to bring them back to the United States, not to deploy them to the far-flung reaches of the Indo-Pacific.
And where do you think we are right now? How would you characterise relations between the European contingent and the US leadership within NATO right now? Trump and his lieutenants, Vance and Hegseth, seem pretty determined to keep NATO at arm's distance for now.
They seem determined to keep it at an arm's distance, but the good news is when you look at high-level statements from people like Marco Rubio, even from the current U.S. ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, they've talked about things like the importance of Article 5. And even Trump said during the Volodymyr Zelensky White House visit a couple months ago, which we all remember, that he would come to the defense of countries like the Baltics if they were under attack. So I think there is some question about what the U.S. commitment to NATO looks like going forward. But I think we're past the question about whether or not the United States is going to withdraw itself from the alliance or something like that. I don't think that will happen. And I think that the more Europeans can point to how much they're spending, what capabilities they're developing to take that burden off the United States, the better it will be for the alliance in general going forward.
Just one final one. US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth skipped the Ukraine Defence Contact Group meeting on Wednesday. What does that tell us? I know we're always looking for signs here, but what does that tell us about the likely US support for Ukraine in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Ukraine Defense Contact Group has been this informal grouping of many countries supporting Ukraine for the last few years. This is the first time that the United States has missed it. And of course, when you look at reporting on this subject, it will say that Hegseth wasn't there because of scheduling issues. And I think that's probably partially true. But I also think it points to a larger goal of this administration, which is really to pass the buck to Europe when it comes to future support for Ukraine. And this has been a line that Trump has touted during his campaign, after he was elected and certainly after he was inaugurated. This idea that Europe needs to do more, that they need to take control of the outcome of this war and support Ukraine. And I think that if we are seeing the United States decrease its presence a little bit at meetings like this, it could point to this broader goal of this administration to pass the buck on to Europe, as they've said that they will certainly do.
From the Atlantic Council, Rachel Rizzo, thanks so much.